The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Geir Pedersen, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Geir Pedersen. Geir, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. As I brief you today, I remain acutely conscious of the deep suffering of the Syrian people, who in this decade experience death, injury, displacement, destruction, detention, torture, terror, indignities, instability, de-development, and destitution on a massive scale, and who are now also grappling with COVID-19 and economic collapse. It was with a heavy heart that I learned that many Syrians were among those killed or injured in the tragic explosion in Beirut. Many more Syrians in Lebanon have lost their livelihoods or been left homeless and hungry. And the ramifications for Syrians' humanitarian and economy supply chains and revenue from transit trade will doubtless be significant, given the already collapsing Syrian economy. Let me take this opportunity to inform you with deep sorrow that among the UN personnel injured in the explosion was Deputy Special Envoy Khawla Matar, who was on her way to Damascus as part of consultations to prepare the upcoming session of the Constitutional Committee. However, I'm pleased to say that she is now on the road to recovery, and I'm sure you all join me in extending to her our sincere good wishes for her full return to health and to vigorous pursuit of our shared mission. Mr. President, as I brief you today, preparations are being made to convene this Monday, 24 August, the third session of the small body of the Syrian-owned, Syrian-led, UN-facilitated Constitutional Committee in Geneva. Convening the small body is obviously challenging, given the global COVID-19 pandemic. We have been closely monitoring the spread of the virus in Syria, in Geneva, and indeed across the globe. And we have been following the health advice of our host country citizens, whose generous support I deeply appreciate, and the guidance from the United Nations office at Geneva, where the committee meetings take place. In light of all the information and expert advice available to us, and barring any further developments in the coming days related to the pandemic, and with the agreement of the co-chairs and the positive response of committee members, we are planning to move ahead. We are in contact with the co-chairs nominated by the government of the Syrian Arab Republic and the co-chair nominated by the opposition Syrian Negotiations Commission, as well as members of the middle third, to make the necessary arrangements. And we will, of course, be implementing strict health and safety protocols to mitigate risks. After a hiatus of 9 months caused by differences over the agenda until March this year, and then by COVID-19 restrictions, it is worth reminding ourselves that the Constitutional Committee meets on the basis of an agreement between the government and the opposition that guides its work. This was, let us recall, the first political agreement between the parties to begin to implement a key aspect of Security Council Resolution 2254, which called for setting a schedule and process for drafting a new constitution. That agreement reflects some key principles, including respect for the United Nations Charter, Security Council resolutions, Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity, the Syrian-led and owned nature of the process, and the role of the United Nations as a facilitator. The agreement calls on the co-chairs to promote gender mainstreaming in the work of the Constitutional Committee, which builds on the achievement of the representation of women at nearly 30%. The agreement also recalls wider objectives. Let me remind you, UN supervised elections as envisaged in Resolution 2254, based on a new constitution, and the need for a broader political process to implement Security Council Resolution 2254. And the agreement mandates the committee, within the context of the UN-facilitated Geneva process, to, and I quote, prepare and draft for popular approval a constitutional reform as a contribution to the political settlement in Syria and the implementation of Resolution 2254. Mr. President, this is indeed a momentous task, to establish a foundational act, a social contract for Syrians, after a decade of conflict, and amidst deep division and mistrust. Mr. President, as you know, constitutions express the sovereignty of the nation and concern fundamental rights, political, cultural, social, and economic rights, rule of law, and good governance, the people's relation with the government, how political representatives are elected, and what their powers and responsibilities are. During and between the sessions, I have been ready to support the co-chairs and committee members to help bridge differences by exercising my good offices, and I have sought to facilitate in a manner that ensures the committee's continuing credibility, balance, and inclusivity in accordance with my mandate and the agreement that brought the committee to life. Excuse me. This forthcoming session has been made possible by the co-chairs agreeing an agenda which is, and I quote, in line with the mandate, the terms of reference and core routes of procedure of the Constitutional Committee discussing national foundations and principles. Let me reiterate my appreciation to the co-chairs for reaching this agreement. I recall the pragmatic and business-like way in which they chaired proceedings, particularly during the first session, when there also was an agreed agenda. I therefore look forward to meeting them on their arrival in Geneva and to their positive chairing of the next session. Mr. President, in the same spirit, I continue to encourage all committee members to come to Geneva, ready to engage in earnest on the substance on the basis of the agenda that the co-chairs have agreed, without, of course, any preconditions. And consistent with prudent mitigation measures relevant to the pandemic, I believe we should work together now to move this process forward in a business-like manner with a series of regular meetings in the months ahead, including an agenda for the next meeting. Mr. President, this is important because millions of Syrians continue to face immense suffering and do not have the luxury of time to await a political breakthrough of some kind. Civil society interlocutors often tell us that they know a single meeting of the Constitutional Committee will not bring immediate changes on the ground. But substantial and serious engagement by all parties would give them hope that a meaningful process is on the horizon that could have a long-lasting and positive impact on the lives of the Syrian people. Frustration with the lack of progress on the political process has been continuously impressed upon me by the members of the Women's Advisory Board. They continue to meet virtually, and I will be consulting with them, I believe, later this week on Friday, and then again next week during the Constitutional Committee's work. The WAB themselves are working together to support the constitutional process and promote gender and women's rights, and they continue to draw attention to the spread of COVID-19 in already vulnerable communities, the economic sufferings of Syrians, and the urgent humanitarian needs of the most vulnerable of society, female-headed households, Syrian refugees, and internally displaced, and families struggling to cope with extreme poverty. Mr. President, our concern for the impact of the pandemic on the Syrian people remains acute and is growing. As of 18 August, the total official number of COVID-19 cases in Syria is 2,114, including 1,844 confirmed by the Ministry of Health in government-held areas, 51 cases in the northwest Syria, including the first cases in 2 IDP camps, and 219 in the northeast. Of course, overall testing capacity has increased, but remains vastly insufficient. Therefore, as Under-Secretary General Lowcock told this council last month, the true number of cases is probably much higher, and the pandemic impact may be far more serious than these numbers suggest. We already see that all areas are experiencing significant shortages of medical and personal protective equipment, and there are concerns about the effect of COVID-19 on health workers. I think there's someone talking, but let me continue. The UN family is leading preparedness and mitigation measures across the country, but the needs are immense and resources insufficient. We need your continued support, including in securing humanitarian access for all those in need of relief, in accordance with international humanitarian law. And we need to sustain the provision of waivers of sanctions that can undermine the capacity of the country to ensure access to food, essential health supplies, and COVID-19 medical support to respond to the pandemic. Mr. President, we also need a complete, immediate nationwide ceasefire, as called for in Resolution 2254, and to enable an all-out effort to combat the pandemic. In the northwest, the calm brought about by Russian and Turkish efforts continues to largely hold. But the last month has seen reports of sustained mutual rocket attacks, artillery strikes, ground clashes, and sporadic airstrikes, including reports of civilians being injured and killed in these incidents. Meanwhile, earlier this week, the Turkish Ministry of Defense stated that an IED targeted a joint Russian-Turkish patrol, damaging a Turkish vehicle. Subsequently, yesterday, there was a brief uptick through government airstrikes in northern Idlib. Throughout August, we have heard of both sides reinforcing or even establishing new military positions along front lines. Mr. President, we urge in particular Turkey and Russia to contain all escalatory incidents and dynamics, restore the calm, and continue cooperation. And we appeal for all the relevant actors to ensure that any action taken to address Security Council-listed terrorist groups are effective, targeted, and in line with international humanitarian law, ensuring the protection of civilians. Meanwhile, ISIL attacks continue to grow in frequency and impact. The Northeast has seen ongoing skirmishes and security incidents in and around Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, resulting in civilian casualties, as well as protests in Deir ez-Zor following the killing of prominent tribal figures there. Yesterday, an IED targeted Russian forces in Deir ez-Zor, killing a Russian general and injuring 2 officers. Earlier this week, we also saw reports of an altercation between Syrian government and United States forces. Syrian state media accused the United States of opening fire from the air and ground on the Syrian government checkpoint, killing 1 soldier and injuring 2 others. The US-led coalition says it had come under fire from individuals in the vicinity, responded in self-defense, and denies that aircraft were used. Mr. President, this incident is another stark reminder of the need for a sustainable arrangement for the Northeast, inclusive of all actors, that respect and ultimately restores Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity in line with Resolution 2254. The Southwest has seen recurring tensions, as well as protests and several violent incidents, some resulting in fatalities. Geopolitical tensions remain acute too. Earlier this month, Israel stated that it carried out airstrikes on military targets, killing 4 men whom Israel claims were planting explosives at the perimeter of the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. The Syrian government stated that these missiles caused material damage. Mr. President, some of these developments remind us that many of the tensions and incidents taking place across Syria are international in scope, that Syria's sovereignty remains compromised, and that the presence of 5 foreign armies creates a serious risk of threats to international peace and security. This is one reason why the Constitutional Committee's work can be a door opener, but it cannot, in and of itself, resolve the conflict. There is a real need for constructive diplomacy among key international players if all aspects of my mandate, as enshrined in the Resolution 2254, are to be moved forward. I hope that forthcoming opportunities for direct contacts among key players will enable them to deepen their conversations and bridge the often significant gaps between their stated positions, and also enable united support behind the UN effort. I see ample scope for key international players to make a difference, working together and with Syrians, step by step, on the range of issues critical to realizing my mandate, Resolution 2254. That is, ensuring the release of detainees, abductees, and clarifying the fate of missing persons, creating a safe, calm, and neutral environment in which refugees can return safely, voluntarily, and with dignity. Reaching a final political settlement that meets the Syrian people's legitimate aspirations, built around a new constitution and inclusive, free and fair elections under UN supervision, addressing the presence of the 5 foreign armies, and fully restoring Syria's sovereignty. Excuse me. Let me repeat. And fully restoring Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, territorial integrity. There are also other issues where there remain ample room for constructive diplomacy, such as sanctions and working towards Syria's economic recovery and prosperity. Mr. President, but for now, for the next week, let us focus on supporting the members of the Constitutional Committee, deepen their work, and build some confidence in the political route out of the Syrian conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Special Envoy, Geir, for your briefing. Now, before giving the floor to those council members who wish to make statement, I would like first of all to welcome our new colleagues, Ambassador Philip Kridelka, the new permanent representative of Belgium. Welcome, Philip. Now, I would like to give the floor to the first members that wishes to take the floor. Ambassador Kelly, United States, you have the floor.
Thank you, Johnny. And thank you, Special Envoy Peterson, for your briefing. Before I begin my remarks, I would like to express our gratitude to you and to your deputy, Hawal al-Mukhtar, and wish her a speedy recovery from her injuries suffered during the August 4th explosion in Beirut. Also, before I begin today, I want to take a moment to note the irony in discussing this issue after the results of last Friday's vote on renewing an arms embargo on Iran. Iran continues to engage in activity in Syria that is counter to the interest of the Syrian people, and yet many members of this council voted on Friday to enable Iran to buy and sell even more deadly weapons. Iran's support for its proxies in Syria only helps to bolster the Assad regime and undermine the UN process. How will giving Iran access to more weapons serve the interest of international peace and security? I hope our colleagues who voted against or abstained on Friday's vote will explain to the Syrian people today how your support for the Iranian regime is helping to make life better. They deserve that from you. On today's topic of the political situation in Syria, the United States remains encouraged and hopeful that the third meeting of the Constitutional Committee just 5 days from now in Geneva will yield a clear path forward for the political process. The Syrian people are counting on every representative to this Constitutional Committee to make the August 24th meeting count. Now is the time for urgency, compromise, and action. It is our hope that next week the committee, under Special Envoy Peterson's facilitation, can achieve the following goals. First, it is important the parties move beyond previous discussions of first principles and instead directly address constitutional reforms. We encourage the UN facilitators to push back against attempts by any delegation to stall the substantive work of the committee and, if necessary, publicly call out any attempts to obstruct the proceedings. Second, we hope that the committee members are willing to remain in Geneva for weeks, if possible, and engage in substantive discussions on future constitutional reforms for more than just a day or two. And third, we encourage the parties to agree to a schedule of future rounds of Constitutional Committee meetings throughout the fall of 2020 to show all parties are committed to advancing the political process. The 10-month gap between the second and third round of Constitutional Committee meetings sapped the hard-earned positive momentum this council helped generate for the parties to successfully launch the Constitutional Committee in October 2019. A schedule for future meetings in advance will advance trust between the parties and, most importantly, show the Syrian people that progress is being made to build a new, inclusive Syrian constitution that will pave the way for the new UN-monitored elections as soon as possible. The Trump administration extends its full support to Special Envoy Peterson for his efforts to facilitate the committee's work toward the drafting of a new constitution in line with Resolution 2254. Next week, U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, and Special Envoy Joel Rayburn are traveling to Geneva to underline U.S. support for the UN political process to ensure the success of the Constitutional Committee. It is absolutely critical that these next rounds of meetings are constructive. They must help chart a path for the future meetings and progress in creating a truly representative constitution to make up for lost time due to COVID-19 pandemic. The key to achieving a credible, long-lasting political situation to the Syrian conflict is a permanent nationwide ceasefire. The Council must remain united in our shared commitment that there is only one way forward to bring about a just and lasting peace. The Assad regime must pursue a direct negotiated political solution with the Syrian opposition, facilitated by the United Nations. We call upon the Assad regime and its Russian and Iranian enablers to commit to this political process by halting all further attacks, including the killing of civilians and the destruction of critical civilian infrastructure. We note the disturbing yet unsurprising trend of the increase in COVID-19 cases in Syria. The risk of COVID-19 is especially great for over 100,000 Syrians who remain in arbitrary detention in putrid, overcrowded regime prisons. These detainees must be released immediately and without preconditions in line with Resolution 2254 to ensure their safety and to lay the groundwork for progress toward a political solution. We reiterate our position that there will be no reconstruction, no diplomatic recognition, and no sanctions relief until a political process in line with Resolution 2254 is irreversibly underway. The United States' policy of maximum diplomatic and economic pressure on the Assad regime and its backers is focused on using every tool in our toolbox to protect civilians from further violence and bring the Assad regime back to the negotiating table to fully implement Resolution 2254. There is much work ahead of us to achieve the reforms necessary to facilitate Syria's political transition from a government at war with its own people to a government that serves the Syrian people. A legitimate political process facilitated by the UN will form the backbone of a new post-war Syria, complete with a new constitution, a nationwide ceasefire, and UN-monitored elections that represent the Syrian people. It is time for Assad's needless, brutal war and rampant corruption to come to an end. The regime must heed the calls of Secretary General Guterres and Special Envoy Peterson to agree and adhere to a nationwide ceasefire, provide all Syrians access to humanitarian aid that has been generously provided by many of those on this council, and engage meaningful of the importance of Resolution 2254. A political solution is the only solution that can truly protect the Syrian people and chart a course for a better future. We ask each member of this council to work with us in support of the political process to ensure the legitimate aspirations of Syrians from all corners of this country and the diaspora are fulfilled. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Vasily, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, first of all, would like to wish speedy recovery to Hala Matar, who was injured in this unfortunate situation in Lebanon, and we're glad to hear that she's on the way to recovery. And we thank Geir Pedersen for his briefing. We wish him and the Syrian delegations success in resuming the work of the editorial commission of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva starting on August 24th. We hope that the epidemiological situation will not interfere with these plans. Russia will continue to provide a special envoy and the Syrians with the necessary support, including within the framework of the Astana format, together with Turkey and Iran. At the same time, we remind that this is a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led process which must be safeguarded from any external interference. We consider it important to resume the political dialogue, which will facilitate the consolidation of the Syrians on a national patriotic platform and accordingly serve as an element of strengthening the sovereignty and independence of the Syrian Arab Republic. The main obstacles to the normalization of the situation in Syria are well known. This is the presence of terrorists, foreign occupation of parts of the territory, attempts to overthrow the government by means of sanctions, and playing various ethno-confessional groups against each other. In the Idlib de-escalation zone, terrorist sabotage joined Russian-Turkish patrols, shelling of positions of government forces and nearby settlements, attacks on the Khmeimim airbase are increasing, as well as provocations along the M4 highway. On August 17, an explosive device was detonated along the patrol route, which damaged a Turkish vehicle. Terrorists remained present in other parts of Syria as well. On August 18th, a Russian military convoy was attacked while it was carrying out another humanitarian operation to deliver aid at the Deir az-Zor area. As a result, Major General of the Russian Armed Forces, Vyacheslav Gladkih, and Syrian military representatives died. 2 Russian soldiers were wounded. All attacks by militants will be resolutely suppressed. It is obvious that achievement of a lasting calm in Idlib and other Syrian provinces is possible only if the terrorists from ISIS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and their affiliates are neutralized and their support from abroad is stopped. Mr. President, the situation in Syria is further aggravated by the continued occupation by the United States of areas in the northeast. In addition to the problems of the US-controlled areas related to the activities of ISIS and the dire humanitarian situation, those areas witnessed wide protests of the Arab population against the Kurdish authorities and the American occupation. We again point at the illegal extraction and smuggling of Syrian oil, which poses a threat to the environment not only in Syria but also in Iraq. We took note of the contract signed by the American company Delta Crescent Energy for the production and processing of oil in the Kurdish regions, the fact that was confirmed by Secretary of State Pompeo. We would like to hear more information about this company from our American colleagues, as well as an explanation of how this agreement complies with international law and the sovereignty of Syria. We deem this deal illegal. It is not only about the purposeful plunder of Syria's national natural resources, but also about undermining the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. After all, we were assured that the US Army would only protect oil from ISIS. It is worth mentioning that for the sake of trading oil from Syria, US made an exception from its own sanctions imposed on the oil and gas sector of Syria. It is a testimony for the whole world to see how those so-called humanitarian exemptions from sanctions work. Mr. President, I read an article that appeared in the Foreign Affairs magazine recently with a characteristic and telling title, I quote, "The Pointless Cruelty of Trump's New Syria Sanctions." And indeed, the coercive measures have one goal: to suffocate the Syrian economy and increase sufferings of ordinary Syrians with a view to inciting social protests. Humanitarian exemptions do not work according to humanitarian NGOs themselves. We draw the attention of our Western colleagues who speak of the need to implement Security Council Resolutions 2254 and 2532 to the call of the Secretary General for a ceasefire, that they are very picky about the statements by the Secretary General. They remain deaf to calls to waive sanctions amid the coronavirus pandemic and refuse to include some provisions of Security Council Resolution 2532 in the resolution on the extension of mechanism for cross-border humanitarian supplies. But what ceasefire is this if the United States, which again illegally occupies parts of Syria, strike at government forces? On August 17, US troops fired at the Syrian army post near the settlement of Ter Daat in the province of Hasaki, killing and wounding Syrian soldiers. We are also concerned about the situation in the IDP camps, primarily in the Al-Hol camp, where first coronavirus cases were recorded. There are never-ending reports of riots in prisons and escape of terrorists. Mr. President, drawing a conclusion from all this, we once again call for an early end to the foreign occupation of Syria and attempts to divide the country. The only way to bring peace to Syria is to return all its lands under the control of Damascus and promote a political settlement through a comprehensive and inclusive Syrian dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Now I would like to invite the distinguished representative of Niger. Niger, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Mr. Pedersen for his presentation. Niger reiterates its support to the calls by the Secretary General and his Special Envoy for a nationwide ceasefire in Syria to enable an all effort against the COVID pandemic. We remain very concerned about the humanitarian situation as we are witnessing an increasing in the number of cases of COVID in Syria. Additionally, we hear from local that the economic crisis is deepening poverty and pushing more people into humanitarian need. Niger commends the effort of humanitarian agencies in delivering the much-needed assistance to the most vulnerable population throughout Syria and their ability to adapt to the shifting conditions on the ground. Mr. President, as we have stated in previous meeting, there could be no military solution to the to the Syrian crisis. The Russian and Turkish ceasefire agreement of March, although fragile, is still holding and has helped reduce hostilities in northwest Syria. Niger reiterates its call upon the Council members and the Special Envoy Pedersen to build on this momentum in order to make progress towards a comprehensive ceasefire and the political front as mandated by Resolution 2254. Niger remains convinced that the formula for ending the Syrian crisis must be inspired by the Syrians themselves in their various components in accordance with Resolution 2254. So we are pleased to hear that the Constitutional Committee meeting is happening next week and that the agreement on the agenda was reached. Although my delegation remains optimistic about the upcoming round of talks, we would like to reiterate our call on all parties to be more flexible during this round of negotiation in order to advance the political track and lead to us a lasting peace in Syria. In the same vein, in an effort to help build confidence between the parties, as the Constitution Committee meeting is set to convene, Niger calls on both sides to show empathy in these unprecedented times by proceeding with the release of the detainee on both sides and clarifying the situation of missing persons. To conclude, Mr. President, Niger recognizes the danger posed by terrorist groups in Syria elsewhere. Hence, we believe that the Syrian government, like any other state, has the right to fight terrorism in tandem with the fight against the pandemic in compliance with international human rights and international humanitarian obligations with regard to the protection of civilian infrastructure and the principle of proportionality. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Niger. Now I would like to invite the distinguished representative of Estonia. Gert, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen for his briefing, which highlighted the different challenges the country is facing in its 10th year of war. We also join others in wishing quick recovery for Deputy Special Envoy Matar. As many other council members, we are looking closely at the situation in Syria. Despite the March ceasefire largely holding in Idlib, we remain concerned about the sporadic clashes in the area, such as the exchange of fire between Turkish and Syrian troops in the past weeks. Further, terrorist threats persist. Just yesterday, a roadside bomb killed several people near Deir ez-Zor. Most likely it was ISIS extremists who had planted the improvised explosive device there. These and other similar incidents continue to undermine stability in northern and eastern parts of Syria. Mr. President, regarding the political developments, Estonia expresses hope that the new round of talks next week in Geneva for the Syrian Constitutional Committee will accelerate the political process. This also includes answering the legitimate concerns of the Syrian opposition. However, we note that a new constitution alone is not enough for solving Syria's problems. National reconciliation requires much more, including the release of arbitrarily detained people and political prisoners, disclosure of the fates of disappeared and missing people, respect for human rights, and free elections. Only after fulfilling these basic criteria, the situation would slowly start to normalize and refugees would be able to return the country. Unfortunately, we are still far from this, as it was highlighted by the various challenges in today's briefing by the Special Envoy. Estonia and the European Union remain committed to finding a lasting and credible political solution to the conflict in Syria on the basis of Resolution 2254 and of the 2012 Geneva Communiqué. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Estonia. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of China. China, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Special Envoy Mr. Pedersen for his briefing. We appreciate his relentless efforts and good offices in promoting the political process in Syria. The Syrian crisis has entered its 10th year. The prolonged conflict has caused tremendous sufferings for the Syrian people. It's incumbent on the international community to stop the crisis and endeavor to find a fundamental solution as early as possible. It's China's consistent position that the Syrian issue must be addressed in a holistic way, taking into account political, security, counterterrorism, economic, and humanitarian factors in an integrated manner. Under the current situation, I would like to remark on 4 priorities. First, the political process must be accelerated. This is the only way to achieve a lasting peace and stability in Syria. The parties concerned should actively and pragmatically participate in and advance the inclusive political dialogue within the framework of Constitutional Committee. We hope to see the parties concerned strive for an early solution that fits Syria's national conditions and takes into account the legitimate concerns of both sides. The UN should play its role as the main channel for mediation towards a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned political process, while the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria is safeguarded. Mr. Pedersen just briefed the Council on preparations for the third round meeting of the Syrian Constitutional Committee. We call on all parties to demonstrate political will and bridge differences through dialogue and consultation, so that the meeting could go smoothly and achieve positive results. China appreciates the active support from Russia and other countries to the UN-led process through their own efforts. Second, the security situation in Syria should be substantially improved. There are still a large number of terrorists and extremists in the Idlib region, launching frequent attacks and harming civilians. All parties must stick to a unified standard and strengthen coordination in counterterrorism actions. As Mr. Pedersen proposed, more effective, cooperative, and targeted counterterrorism actions must be in place to promote peace and stability in Syria and the region. Russia and Turkey conducted regular joint patrols along M4 highway in recent months, in accordance with relevant agreements, which helped to maintain overall ceasefire in northwest Syria. With regard to the recent airstrikes against the Syrian government-controlled areas, the parties concerned is called upon to exercise restraint and take no more such actions. Third, unilateral sanctions against Syria must be lifted immediately. Unilateral sanctions have seriously undermined the livelihood of the Syrian people and caused great harm to innocent civilians, especially women and children. We urge relevant countries to heed the repeated appeals by the Secretary General and his special envoy. Instead of imposing new illegal sanctions, those countries should immediately lift existing unilateral sanctions against Syria and take concrete actions to improve the humanitarian situation on the ground. China attaches great importance to the humanitarian situation in Syria and sympathizes with the sufferings of the Syrian people. We have provided, through bilateral and multilateral channels, a large amount of humanitarian assistance, including medical supplies to combat COVID-19, to people in Syria and refugees outside the country. China will continue to support and assist the Syrian people according to what they need. Fourth, more efforts should be made to help Syria with economic reconstruction. This is the urgent need of the Syrian people and the foundation for sustainable development and the durable peace of Syria. The international community should support the reconstruction efforts of the Syrian government and Syrian people, help them rebuild and recover as soon as possible in areas which have suitable conditions. China will undoubtedly make its contribution in this regard. Mr. President, The future of Syria should be decided by the Syrian people themselves. China will continue to stand with the Syrian people and play a positive and constructive role in the political settlement of the Syrian issue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. Now I would like to invite the distinguished representative of South Africa. Martinus, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to start out by adding our voice to that of other members of the Council in wishing Deputy Special Envoy Matar a speedy recovery and thank Special Envoy Pedersen for the information about her well-being. We also thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen for his briefing today on the situation in Syria. South Africa fully supports your efforts, Special Envoy Pedersen, as well as that of your office, as you continue to work towards finding a lasting solution to end the conflict in Syria that would culminate in the drafting of a new constitution, conducting of free and fair elections, and the restoration of Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, territorial integrity, and economic prosperity. In this regard, South Africa welcomes the upcoming meeting of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva, and we commend your efforts, Special Envoy Pedersen, to convene this session. Progress by the Constitutional Committee is indeed a long-awaited step on the path to a Syrian-led and owned political process. The Constitutional Committee plays an important role in fostering political discussion and trust among Syrians, and in ensuring that the voices of all Syrians are heard. We call on all the participants to this third meeting of the Constitutional Committee to actively engage in the substantive discussions on the committee's agenda. The only way forward is through meaningful dialogue on how best to move Syria from a war-torn state to a peaceful and stable member of the international community. In order to achieve this, the people and government of Syria, represented by the Constitutional Committee, require the Security Council's full support and the continued support of the United Nations as a whole. Mr. President, in support of the Constitutional Committee process, the parties must ensure that violence and hostilities in the country come to an end. South Africa therefore supports the Special Envoy's call for a complete and immediate nationwide ceasefire, in line with the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. A permanent ceasefire would allow the political process to continue in an environment where an inclusive Syrian-led dialogue can take place. Additionally, the parties should continue to engage in trust and confidence measures. Given the rapid spread of COVID-19 in Syria and the cramped conditions in detention centers that have limited water and sanitation, we call on the parties to release detainees and political prisoners, especially women and children, as well as the sick and elderly who are most susceptible to this virus. South Africa welcomes the measures taken by the Syrian authorities to slow the spread of COVID-19 and the continued support of the UN humanitarian agencies and partners who have continued to work in challenging circumstances to provide the necessary assistance to those in need. The spread of the COVID-19 virus has made the need for this assistance even more urgent. In order to aid this effort, the international community must lift the unilateral coercive economic measures imposed on the Syrian government. These measures exacerbate the already dire humanitarian situation that has been further impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and place an additional burden on those who so desperately need humanitarian aid and assistance. Mr. President, South Africa fully supports the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria and reiterate our concern at the continued presence of foreign and armed forces in Syria. External interference in Syria must come to an end, especially in terms of the support provided to these armed groups. We are also concerned at the continued presence of terrorist groups operating in parts of the country. We reiterate that while all states have the sovereign right to address the threat of terrorism in their own countries, actions to counter terrorism must be in compliance with international human rights and international humanitarian law responsibilities and obligations. In conclusion, Mr. President, South Africa believes that the political and humanitarian tracks in Syria are interlinked, and we call on all stakeholders to promote progress in both tracks to ensure a sustainable and peaceful settlement to the conflict. As has been stated before on numerous occasions, there can be no military solution to the conflict in Syria. South Africa hopes that the discussions in Geneva next week are able to move the political process towards a peaceful, stable, and secure Syria. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of France. Anne, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je m'exprimerai en français. Je remercie Geert Pedersen pour sa présentation et je réitère le plein soutien de la France à son action. Je le prie également de bien vouloir transmettre à Madame Raoula Mattar mes vœux de prompt et complet rétablissement. Je souhaiterais aborder 4 points. Tout d'abord, un mot sur le comité constitutionnel, puisque son comité de rédaction se réunit la semaine prochaine. Il est positif que cette réunion se tienne enfin. Nous appelons les partis à y participer de bonne foi, sans condition et sans chercher à multiplier les manœuvres dilatoires. La France souhaite que les travaux sur la nouvelle constitution que prévoit la résolution 2254 avancent réellement. Nous appelons en particulier ceux qui parrainent le régime dans ces discussions à intensifier leurs efforts et nous soutenons sans réserve l'envoyé spécial dans ce processus. Nous l'encourageons à poursuivre en parallèle ces discussions avec le Conseil consultatif des femmes, Women Advisory Board, afin de permettre la participation effective des femmes, comme l'indique la résolution 2254. Malheureusement, nous avons toutes les raisons d'être pessimistes concernant les discussions à venir. Le simulacre d'élections législatives du mois dernier montre que le régime s'enferme dans sa logique dictatoriale et suit son propre calendrier, au mépris de ce que prévoit la résolution 2254. L'absence de progrès sur la question des personnes détenues et disparues est un autre signal négatif. Comment croire à la bonne foi du régime quand il refuse de permettre à des personnes innocentes de retrouver leur famille? Deuxièmement, je voudrais rappeler qu'un règlement politique à la crise syrienne ne se résume pas à une discussion constitutionnelle. Il est donc crucial que l'envoyé spécial s'investisse sur tous les volets de la crise comme le prévoit la résolution 2254. Je pense en particulier au cessez-le-feu. La trêve conclue au nord-ouest il y a quelques mois est fragile. Les affrontements violents se poursuivent. Un accord de cessez-le-feu durable et vérifiable sous l'égide des Nations Unies est indispensable pour permettre à la fois la reprise sereine du processus politique et le bon acheminement de l'aide humanitaire qui connaît des restrictions critiques depuis la fermeture du point de passage frontalier de Bab es-Salam. Je rappelle que ce Conseil a adopté la résolution 2532 appelant à la cessation des hostilités dans tous les pays qui figurent à son agenda, en écho à l'appel du secrétaire général pour un cessez-le-feu global. L'instabilité et la violence continuent de prévaloir, y compris dans les territoires repris par le régime, avec des assassinats, des enlèvements, des troubles, dont les civils sont les premières victimes. Nous rappelons à cet égard que la France continue d'apporter son plein soutien à la lutte contre l'impunité, y compris à travers les mécanismes internationaux. Les crimes commis en Syrie ne peuvent rester impunis. Nous sommes donc encore loin de l'environnement sûr et neutre nécessaire à la transition politique et à l'organisation d'élections libres et transparentes sous la supervision des Nations Unies, auxquelles participeraient tous les Syriens, y compris les réfugiés et les déplacés. Nous encourageons l'envoyé spécial à continuer d'y œuvrer. Il a un plein mandat pour notamment travailler sur les conditions pratiques de tenue de ces élections, même si celles-ci doivent avoir lieu après les travaux du comité constitutionnel. Troisièmement, j'aimerais dire un mot sur la situation de la population syrienne qui est la première victime de la guerre et de la mauvaise gestion d'un régime corrompu. Elle doit aujourd'hui faire face à la pandémie de Covid-19, qui connaît une recrudescence majeure en Syrie et s'ajoute à la catastrophe humanitaire à laquelle sont confrontés les Syriens et les Syriennes. Alors que les besoins humanitaires ne cessent d'augmenter et qu'une grande partie de la population reste forcée de vivre en exil, je veux rappeler que la France et ses partenaires de l'Union européenne se tiennent résolument aux côtés du peuple syrien, comme en témoignent les engagements pris lors de la conférence de Bruxelles IV. Enfin, quatrièmement, je souhaite conclure en disant que nos positions sur la levée des sanctions, la reconstruction et la normalisation demeurent inchangées. Notre détermination à contribuer à trouver une solution politique à la crise syrienne, elle, est aussi intacte. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Anne. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany. Günther, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thanks to Gaia for the briefing. Please convey our best wishes to Kavla. I would like to make 4 remarks, one on the security situation, one on the political process, one on detainees, and one on accountability. On the security situation, we remain concerned about the fragile security situation throughout the country. In particular, we are worried that a new military offensive in or around Idlib would only result in more mass displacements and humanitarian catastrophe. This is something that should be avoided at any cost. We therefore continue to fully support the call of Special Envoy Geir Pedersen for a complete, immediate and nationwide ceasefire. On the political process, there is a clear way out. It has been expressed by many delegations. This is also the position of Germany. The political process under the auspices of the United Nations, in line with Resolution 2254 and the Geneva Communiqué of 2012, is the way to go. In this context, I would like to make it very clear, once a comprehensive, genuine and inclusive political transition is firmly underway, Germany and the EU will assist in reconstruction, but not before this. In this context, when the Syrian regime changes its brutal behavior and ends its grave violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, there will also come a point for EU sanctions to be lifted. The issue of sanctions has been touched upon by previous speakers. I would like to make it very clear, as we have done before, the sanctions imposed by the European Union contain clear humanitarian exemptions, and we work very hard to make sure that these humanitarian exemptions are implemented faithfully in a way that does not create humanitarian damage. Let me add in this context that much more humanitarian damage is done by closing border crossings into Syria. To allow for progress on the political process, the 3rd round of the Constitutional Committee, starting on the 24th of August, will be an important step. This is another occasion for the Syrian regime to demonstrate that it is serious about the political process. We urge in this context that Russia use its influence over Damascus in order to create the right spirit. We agree with Special Envoy Geir Pedersen that the Constitutional Committee alone will not suffice. We also need to see progress in the broader political process and the full implementation of Resolution 2254. My 3rd point is on detainees. Resolution 2254 calls for the immediate release of arbitrarily detained persons, particularly women and children. But since its adoption in December 2015, almost 5 years ago, there has been no progress here. 3 concrete points are crucial here. Firstly, we urge all parties, in particular the Syrian regime, which holds the overwhelming majority of detainees, to immediately release all arbitrarily detained persons, starting with the most vulnerable: women, children, sick, wounded, elderly. Secondly, The Syrian regime must also allow for immediate, unconditional, and unhindered access for relevant humanitarian organizations to all its prisons and detention facilities. Thirdly, the Syrian regime must inform the families of the fate and the whereabouts of the tens of thousands missing and disappeared persons. My fourth and last point is on accountability. We remain convinced national reconciliation and a sustainable peace in Syria will only be possible once truth, justice, and accountability for all crimes and atrocities committed during the Syrian conflict are established. In its latest report, the Commission of Inquiry has detailed human rights violations and war crimes in Idlib. This reporting, as well as the findings of the OPCW investigation and identification team and the Board of Inquiry, demonstrate that the Syrian regime and its allies are responsible for indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in northwest Syria. There has not been appropriate follow-up to these findings yet. We must not tolerate impunity. Russia and China have blocked the referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. It is their responsibility that those who have committed and are still committing the most serious crimes in Syria cannot be brought to justice before the ICC. National jurisdictions are starting to at least fill some of the void in Germany and elsewhere. The message is clear: whoever commits crimes against humanity or war crimes cannot feel safe anywhere and will eventually be held accountable. We therefore call on all states to use all legal means at their disposal to prosecute the perpetrators and to initiate criminal proceedings under the principle of international universal jurisdiction. We call on this Council to finally live up to its responsibility, join the fight against impunity, and to ensure that the most serious crimes under international law be held. Thank you.
Thank you, Germany. Can I ask those that has the mic open to close the mic so we could hear the colleagues that are taking the floor? Now I have the next speaker on my list is the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic. Jose, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We also would like to wish speedy recovery for Special Envoy Mata. We thank Special Envoy Pedersen for his report, and as always, express the full support of the Dominican Republic to the political process in the Syrian Arab Republic, so that once and for all, Syrians can start building the hope, trust, and confidence they deserve to emerge from this horrible conflict. There's no military solution to the Syrian conflict. The only sustainable solution will be on the basis of a broad political process, as outlined in Resolution 2254 of this Council, and on the will to achieve its full implementation. Hope the Syrian government understands this. We are pleased with the arrangements for the holding of the new and hopefully revitalized talks among the parties in the framework of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva next week. Mr. President, to achieve a successful outcome on these talks, one that is conducive to a renewed commitment to the political process, all parties need to engage constructively, in good faith, and mutual respect. We therefore encourage the members of the CC to frame all their efforts in alleviating the precarious living conditions of the Syrian population and in restoring their prospects of life in peace and dignity, and where their rights are protected and fully met. Again, the resurgence of hope and trust in the political process is at the core of the country's future reconciliation. Women's voices must resonate louder than ever in all aspects of the broader political process, but especially in the Constitutional Committee as a fundamental piece towards the creation of a new national configuration based on the rule of law, respect for human rights, and the fundamental freedoms of all citizens. We reiterate our call for the full and meaningful equality-based participation of women at all stages of the constitutional talks. Mr. President, allow me to highlight a few points on the reconciliation. For the Dominican Republic, reconciliation in Syria will only be possible if it's based on a credible political response to the legitimate aspirations of Syrians and in line with Resolution 2254. Also, in the provision of durable solutions to the civilian population, including the IDPs and refugees spread across the region and beyond. They need to be able to return to their homes or where they choose in a safe, voluntary, and dignified manner. And finally, Mr. President, families of detainees, abductees, and missing persons need to know the fate of their loved ones. It is their right. We therefore request you, Mr. Pedersen, for increased efforts and results in this regard. This includes listening to the families themselves and working together with them to find ways to move forward. You have our full support in this endeavor and respectfully request you to provide on your next briefing more information on this file. To conclude, we remain extremely concerned about the current compounding crises present in Syria. The impacts of the economic crisis, as well as its potential devastating inability to cope with COVID-19 outbreaks, threatens to throw the country into unsuspected and unprecedented despair. This Council has a long-standing moral responsibility to alleviate the suffering of the people. This starts with joining efforts in preventing more suffering and ensuring that the mounting humanitarian needs are met in a principled, unhindered, and sustained way. Let us join forces towards that end in solidarity and based on our common humanity. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor. UK.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Special Envoy Pedersen for his briefing. I would like to start by once again mourning the loss of life due to the tragic events in Lebanon on 4th of August, which sadly included a large number of Syrian refugees, and as we have just heard, Deputy Special Envoy Matar. I would like to join others in wishing her a speedy recovery. All of this is a reminder of the magnitude of the Beirut tragedy, but also of how generous Lebanon has been in responding to the crisis in neighbouring Syria. We are deeply concerned by the escalating COVID-19 situation in Syria. There are now over 1,650 confirmed cases, with cases in regime-held areas more than doubling in the first 10 days of August, and those in northeast Syria growing rapidly. We understand the actual number of cases to be far greater. This Council has feared a dramatic rise in cases in Syria, and it appears that this may well have now begun. It remains incumbent on us all to ensure that the necessary medical and humanitarian assistance reaches all of those in need. We are also deeply concerned by the fragile nature of the ceasefire in northwest Syria, particularly in the context of an increase in COVID-19 cases. We strongly supported the ceasefire agreed by the presidents of Russia and Turkey on the 5th of March and welcomed the fact that it appeared to be broadly holding. This granted millions of Syrians in Idlib some respite and allowed hundreds of thousands to return to their homes. We are therefore concerned at the apparent erosion of the ceasefire in recent weeks, in particular an uptick in appalling attacks by extremist groups, notably on joint Russian-Turkish patrols, as well as repeated airstrikes by Russian and regime forces. As I said last month, we know what the humanitarian impact of a breakdown in the ceasefire would be. The 7th of July Commission of Inquiry report found evidence of widespread, indiscriminate attacks by regime and pro-regime forces on civilians, hospitals and schools, with reasonable grounds to believe that war crimes had been committed by the regime and Hayat Tahrir Hassan. The UK therefore calls for the immediate and sustained cessation by all parties, of hostilities by all parties, in line with requests by the UN Secretary-General and the UN Special Envoy. Neither Syria nor the region can cope with another entirely unnecessary humanitarian disaster on top of a significant COVID-19 outbreak. This Council is meeting just before the resumption of Constitutional Committee talks in Geneva. It is vital that all parties engage genuinely and properly with this process, and that they refrain from reimposing unnecessary conditions like those pushed in November. The representatives of the regime and opposition and independent figures meeting in Geneva need to make progress on the real issues facing the country. All parties need to be driven by the urgency of the appalling situation in Syria. Ordinary Syrians, whether they are struggling at home or living difficult lives as refugees, don't have weeks, months, or years to waste. They want the war to end and a negotiated political solution which enables reconciliation and reconstruction of the country. We must also remember that the Constitutional Committee is just one part of the wider political process set out in Security Council Resolution 2254. Progress on the Constitutional Committee must be accompanied by immediate action on other issues, such as the widespread release of political prisoners and vulnerable people, making medical care available for those in detention, and making progress on building the conditions for the safe and voluntary return of refugees and internally displaced persons. Now is the time to seize this opportunity. We would also like to take this opportunity to remind all actors of the importance of ensuring the meaningful participation of women in the UN-facilitated political process for Syria, as the Security Council made clear in Resolution 2254. Finally, I would like to say a word on sanctions. Our sanctions are targeted and impose asset freezes and travel bans against specific individuals and asset freezes on specific entities. Those targeted are responsible for human rights abuses against ordinary Syrians, such as repression, arbitrary detention, and violence against demonstrators, and who support or benefit from the Assad regime, including enriching themselves through luxury housing complexes built on land expropriated from Syrians who have fled, been arrested, or killed. A separate EU sanctions regime targets those involved in the proliferation of chemical weapons. In addition, we apply some trade and sectoral restrictions designed to restrain the Assad regime's ability to fund and wage war against its own people, including through the use of chemical and biological weapons. These sanctions do not apply to food, medicine, medical equipment, or medical assistance. Humanitarian exemptions apply to other equipment where this is needed, further mitigating the impact of sanctions on humanitarian programs. We will continue to work with organizations and individuals to ensure that measures do not affect humanitarian operations in Syria, and that organizations and individuals are able to import non-conflict related goods. It is not the case that our opposition to sanctions language in the recent cross-border resolution is evidence that sanctions are a problem. As we have said repeatedly, our sanctions on the Syria regime have wide humanitarian exemptions. The reason we objected to this language in the cross-border resolution is because we do not accept any false equivalence between the disastrous effects of regime policies and Chinese and Russian refusal to allow more than one cross-border on the humanitarian in Syria with our targeted sanctions regime. The reason why the Syrian people lack the humanitarian and medical aid they need is not because of our sanctions or because of any lack of generosity on the part of the UK and other international donors. It is, I am sad to say, because of the deliberate policies by the Syrian regime and its supporters to perpetuate the conflict rather than seek reconciliation, to limit humanitarian access, to cut cross-border assistance to make a political point, to make access to aid a political tool, and to spend the state's resources not on improving the welfare of its people, but rather on waging war. Put another way, the problem facing Syria's health sector is not sanctions, but the fact that the regime is more intent on bombing hospitals than building them. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. Now I would like to invite the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Rhonda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Geir, for your usual comprehensive briefing and for your tireless efforts to facilitate Syria's political process. I would also like to welcome our new Belgian colleague, PR, Ambassador Philippe Kredelka. We look forward to working with you. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines remains in full support of achieving a political solution, which is owned and led by the Syrian people and is in accordance with Resolution 2254. We therefore welcome next week's third session of the Constitutional Committee, and it is our hope that it will be characterized by constructive engagement by all parties. Regarding the country's security situation, we are concerned by the continued reports of sporadic violence despite the March ceasefire agreement. We urge all parties to abide by the ceasefire, to exercise maximum restraint, and we reiterate the call for a complete and immediate nationwide cessation of hostilities. Further, we remind parties to the conflict that military and counter-terrorism operations, although necessary for the protection of Syria and the region, must comply with the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Distinction, proportionality, and precaution ought to guide all activities. The COVID-19 pandemic compounds the urgency for lasting peace and stability in Syria. Unfortunately, there has been an upsurge in cases in recent weeks, and due to limited testing capacity, we do not know the true number. A widespread outbreak of COVID-19 would undoubtedly be devastating to the country, especially since the healthcare system has been debilitated by conflict. Nationwide calm will allow for a more robust response to the pandemic. Mr. President, the Syrian economy is in danger of collapse. A decade-long civil war has led to a precarious socio-economic situation, and unilateral coercive measures have intensified the burden. As always, we call and continue to call for the lifting of all unilateral coercive measures, which is inconsistent with international law. Frustrate efforts at stabilizing and revitalizing the economy, and now have the potential to undermine Syria's pandemic response. We remain troubled by the unresolved issues of detainees, abductees, and missing persons. Meaningful action on these matters must be prioritized, especially in consideration of the pandemic. Furthermore, their effective resolution will certainly go a long way towards confidence building and reconciliation in furtherance of the political process. Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity must be respected and should never be rejected in favor of acts of aggression and foreign occupation. The hope of the Syrian people lies within the actions of the international community. We must seek common ground. We must be pragmatic and principled, and we must not fail them. Before closing, Mr. President, it is with profound sadness that we recall the devastating August 4th blasts in Beirut, Lebanon. We express our deepest condolences to the Lebanese people and to the families of the many Syrian refugees who also lost their lives in this terrible tragedy. We also wish Deputy Special Envoy Matar a speedy recovery. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now I would like to invite the distinguished representative of Tunisia. Kais, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank UN Special Envoy for Syria, Mr. Pedersen, for his briefing, and I wish a quick recovery to Ms. Khawla Matar, and let me also warmly welcome our new PR of Belgium, Mr. Philippe Kridelka, and wish him good luck. Mr. President, as the Syrian Constitutional Committee is set to reconvene next week in Geneva, this is a timely opportunity for Council members to apprise where we stand in the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254 and exchange on the way forward. The establishment of the Constitutional Committee a year ago was a significant development and a glimmer of hope, in that it was the first political agreement between Syria's government and opposition to begin implementing a key aspect of Resolution 2254, which is the setting of a schedule and the process for drafting a new constitution. This process has since been deadlocked by violence, terrorism, and entrenched divisions, and subsequently delayed by COVID-19. There is no panacea to the Syrian crisis, only a just political solution along the terms of Resolution 2254, that is, from and to the Syrians and facilitated by the UN, would bring about lasting peace and restore Syria's dignity and Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. Without a negotiated settlement backed by multi-stakeholders, cooperation, and support, this conflict will only bring further loss, destruction, human suffering, and social unrest, and fan regional instability. Without a conducive environment of enduring calm, sustained humanitarian relief, economic recovery, and confidence building, inclusive peace and development would remain elusive, and terrorism, militia, corruption, crime, and COVID-19 would fill the vacuum. It is therefore crucial for the Syrian party to break the deadlock and raise the critical moment Syria is going through today. We urge them to engage constructively and in good faith in the Constitutional Committee talks, seek common ground, and put the good of their own people and their own country first. We express hope that this third round will set in earnest, concrete, agreed steps for Syria's constitutional drafting, while expressing support to Mr. Pedersen's facilitating effort to this end. Mr. President, Tunisia expresses deep concern about the precarious security situation across Syria and the rise of the number of victims of violence among innocent civilians. Following overall improvement in recent months, there are presently forerunning signs of a relapse into large-scale violence, particularly in view of the repeated violation of the standing arrangement in northern Syria. Military reinforcement on the ground, tensions, and military strikes registered over the last days highlight once again the fragility of a full and lasting stabilization of the de-escalation zone in Idlib. We reiterate our appeal for a stepped-up role of the UN Special Envoy in mastering ceasefire efforts and making full use of his mandated prerogatives to ensure an enduring cessation of hostilities. We further reiterate our call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law and take constant care to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, the threat of terrorism and violent extremism has reached staggering levels in Syria. Tunisia is troubled by the growing resilience, sway, and expansion, particularly of listed terrorist groups such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Hayat Tahrir Sham. We are equally troubled by the continuing brazen provocation of terrorist groups and extremists in Idlib. We condemn the second attack carried out against the joint Turkish-Russian patrol along the M4 highway earlier this week. We recall the 26th report of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Mechanism dated 26 June, which details the critical terrorism reality in the Levant and as well as in Iraq, especially against the background of COVID-19. We stress once again the crucial importance of joint and resolved effort in order to address effectively the issue of terrorist and extremist groups in Idlib and beyond, and stemming the plan to exploit, spoil, or defeat the peace process. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia. Now I would like to invite the distinguished representative of Vietnam. Khoi, you have the floor.
I thank Mr. President. I join the other in extending our deepest condolences to the Syrians who lost their family member in Beirut exploration, and to Russia who lost a major general in East Syria yesterday, and so extend our best wishes for the speedy recovery of Deputy Special Envoy Paula Mata. I'd like to thank Special Envoy Gay Pedersen for his briefing. And also welcome the new peer of Belgium, Mr. Philip Kridanka, to UN family and the UNSC. I wish you the best of luck. And I welcome a PR of the Syrian Arab Republic, Mr. Bashar Zafari, to our meeting today. Mr. President, there are only a few days until the next session of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva. As progress has been insufficient for months, the reconvening of the committee is what we all have been long waiting for. My delegation therefore encourages members of the committee to show goodwill and actively engage in constructive dialogues. A productive section will subsequently serve as the good basis to oil the wheels of the broader political process. Like other council members, Vietnam remains a strong supporter of a Syrian-led and a Syrian-no political process facilitated by the United Nations, pursuant to Security Council Resolution 2254, fully adheres to international law and the UN Charter, and with full respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference in the internal affairs of Syria. This is the only way to bring about the long-term peace and stability, thus ending the untold suffering of the Syrian people. We'd also like to take this opportunity to commend the effort of Special Envoy and his team to bring the party together. We will continue to support their important work. Mr. President, while there is hope for progress in political track, the overall situation on the ground is still a source of concerns. Regarding security situation, although Vietnam is pleased to see that the ceasefire agreement in Idlib continues to generally hold, and the effort by the concerned party to this end, there is not any reduction in the numbers of worrisome security incidents in this area. We are also troubled by the reported insurgence of terrorist activities in different parts of Syria. We would also like to reiterate our call for all parties to exercise maximum restraint and refrain from violence. Ensuring a sustainable calm period is of the vital importance to unlock progress in the political domain. It is also critical to continue efforts to eradicate terrorism in line with responsibility under international law, including international humanitarian law. In addition, the socio-economic and humanitarian situations are regrettably getting more and more volatile. While people are struggling for their daily life due to the impact of the severe economic crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic is hitting this country harder day after day. It is alarming to witness that the number of COVID-19 cases has increased by more than 60% in northern Syria in just 1 week. Controlling the spreading of the virus and minimizing its impact on the Syrian people are among the most important tasks now. It is particularly relevant to make sure that the sanctions do not under capacity of the Syrian people to ensure their basic needs, especially in terms of food and healthcare during brutal pandemic. Mr. President, we reiterate our call on the international community to provide unwavering support for the Syrians in all areas and by all means, especially during this challenging time. It is of vital importance that we should not let the situation deteriorate. Syria cannot afford it at the moment. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you to the distinguished representative of Vietnam. Now I would like to invite the Ambassador Philip, distinguished representative of Belgium. You have the floor. Philip, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. President, first of all, I would like to thank you for the warm Indonesian welcome that you gave me to this meeting. Belgium thanks Special Envoy Pedersen for his briefing, and we thank him and his team for their relentless efforts. And I join colleagues to wish Madame Matar a speedy recovery. Mr. President, the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned Constitutional Committee is set to convene in Geneva next week, as we just heard from the Special Envoy. Belgium, like its European Union partners, hopes that this meeting will bring us closer to a path where Syrians can build their own future, a future that meets the Syrian people's legitimate aspirations, that fully restores Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, territorial integrity, and economic prosperity. We encourage all parties, in particular the Syrian authorities, to meaningfully and constructively engage in this meeting. Entrenched positions and divisive rhetoric need not make room for a spirit of compromise, bearing in mind the well-being of all Syrians. The possible lack of agreement on national foundations and principles should not be an impediment to move on to other items. Furthermore, Belgium hopes that the meeting will pave the way for subsequent meetings at regular intervals. We welcome the engagement between the Special Envoy and the Syrian Women's Advisory Board, as well as with other civil society organizations. Mr. President, it is important that the dynamics on the ground change in order to build a trust that is necessary to achieve progress on the political track. Firstly, this means that violence on the ground must end. We must acknowledge that the situation in the northwest remains fragile. The recent protests in southwest Syria have led to various security incidents, including assassinations. Belgium urges all parties to refrain from violence, reduce tension, and exercise maximum restraint. We reiterate our call for a nationwide ceasefire in line with Resolution 2254. The United Nations should play a central role in the monitoring and implementation of such a ceasefire. Furthermore, we call for respect for human rights and international humanitarian law, including in the fight against terrorism. True reconciliation and sustainable peace cannot be achieved without a solution for the issue of detainees, abductees, and missing persons. Belgium calls on the Syrian government and all other Syrian parties to carry out unilateral releases of detainees and abductees and move beyond the one-to-one prisoner exchanges. Access to detainees must be ensured in line with international regulations. We furthermore call for meaningful actions on missing persons. Building confidence is essential if we want to see the political process move forward. The COVID-19 outbreak has amplified the need for a nationwide ceasefire and for the release of arbitrarily detained persons. We are also worried about the impact of COVID-19 on the already dire humanitarian situation. Full humanitarian access must be ensured more than ever. Mr. President, and this will be the end of my presentation, years of war, corruption, mismanagement, and oppression have led to a dire economic situation, further exacerbated by the effects of COVID-19. The European Union sanctions are targeted at those responsible for ordering or carrying out attacks and torture against their own people, making or using chemical weapons, or building their personal fortune on the war economy. They are carefully crafted to avoid any adverse humanitarian effects or unintended consequences for persons who are not targeted. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium. Now I would like to make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Indonesia. First of all, I'd like others to thank Special Envoy Pedersen for your detailed briefing. I also would like to echo others in wishing Deputy Special Envoy Kuala Matar a speedy recovery. My delegation is very pleased to hear from you, Gayer, that the preparation for convening the third round of the Constitutional Committee is back on track. We know that this is only the beginning of a long and challenging political process in Syria. However, this progress is also key for all the Syrian parties to move forward. Many council members have highlighted about the current situation in the country, particularly the ongoing COVID-19 outbreak and economic fragility that further worsen the humanitarian condition in Syria. There are around 2,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the country, and it is likely to spread more in the densely populated areas and among vulnerable IDPs and refugees. The Syrian people need sustained support from the international community, including from this council. The Syrian people need progress, not only on the humanitarian situation, but also on the political settlement process. In light of the above, I would like to emphasize the following points. First, all Syrian parties must continue to engage in the Constitutional Committee process. A genuine and meaningful engagement from the Syrian parties is crucial in order to secure a productive and substantive round of talks among the committee's members. We hope that next week's discussion in Geneva, with the support of key international stakeholders, would be a constructive and successful session that eventually lead to a regular committee's agenda. It is important for all relevant parties to maintain a calm and positive environment during the Constitutional Committee's meeting. Let me reaffirm our strong support to the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process facilitated by the United Nations in accordance with Resolution 2254. Indonesia appreciates the work of the Special Envoy and his team in facilitating the whole progress and wish them well. Second, the waiver of sanction. We share the Secretary General's appeal for the waiver of sanction that can undermine the capacity of Syria to ensure access to food, vital health supplies, and COVID-19 medical assistance to respond to the pandemic. This is indeed the time for solidarity, not exclusion. The third point is a sustained and meaningful action on the issues of detainees and missing persons. Addressing this issue by all Syrian parties is critical for the process of reconciliation and to build trust as well as confidence among all parties. We hope to see significant progress on this file. Before concluding, while the ceasefire agreement in northwest Syria is generally respected, we wish to urge all key actors to maintain its commitment to the agreement and to ensure a sustained calm throughout Syria. Let me once again emphasize my delegation's commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. I thank you. Now I would like to resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Do you hear me, Mr. President?
Yes, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Terima kasih banyak, Sri Datu Dian. Thank you so much, Mr. President. I would like to start by welcoming the Special Envoy, my friend Geir Pedersen, and to wish speed recovery to Mrs. Khawla Matar. I congratulate you, Diane, and the Friendly Republic of Indonesia for presiding over the Security Council for the current month. And I also extend my deep condolences to my colleague, the PR of the Russian Federation and his friendly country, for the painful incident that occurred yesterday and led to the death of a major general and the injury of 2 soldiers of the Russian army by an explosive device planted by the terrorists, as their convoy was targeted after its return from a humanitarian mission in the Syrian governorate of Deir ez-Zor. Mr. President, since the Security Council endorsed the political process as a base for resolving the crisis in my country, some of the permanent members of this council have endeavored to undermine this approach day after day, month after month, and year after year, to the extent that these same members have unfortunately started misusing the council to practically support the terrorist war on Syria and justify their occupation on its lands and their unbridled investment in terrorism. Every time we submitted a complaint to you or informed you of facts about acts of support for terrorism, aggression, occupation, plunder, and destruction of the resources of my country, the more Western pressure increased to deflect the efforts of the Security Council and prevent it from carrying out its role in preserving the provisions of the Charter and ensuring respect for the content of its own resolutions relevant to the situation in Syria, foremost of which is ensuring the full commitment of its sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. And Mr. President, you have rightly pointed out at the end of your statement the same thing, the same phrase. So I thank you very much for reminding the distinguished members of the Council of this sacrosanct reference. This only raises so many questions. What has the Security Council done to end the American occupation of parts of my country? What has it done to put an end to the Turkish occupation and the practices of the terrorism sponsoring Erdogan regime in Idlib and elsewhere? What steps have been taken by your council to support the efforts of the Syrian state and its allies in combating terrorism? International terrorism, by the way. And facing the tens of thousands of terrorists without borders, also known in UN language as foreign terrorist fighters, and holding the governments recruiting, funding, and supporting them accountable. Mr. President, at the time when members of the Security Council pledged at the outset of their resolutions relevant to the situation in my country to a strong commitment to respect the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, the US occupation forces, in full view of the United Nations and the international community, took a new step to plunder Syria's natural resources, including Syrian oil and gas. Recently, as we all know, the US company christened Delta Energy, with the sponsorship and support of the US administration, has entered into a contract with the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, separatist militia, an agent of the US occupation forces in northeastern Syria, with the aim of stealing Syrian oil and depriving the Syrian state and Syrian people of those basic revenues necessary to improve the humanitarian situation, provide for livelihood needs and reconstruction. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, an unknown company born out of nowhere, headed by US previous ambassador in Denmark, James Keen, a retired American Delta Force officer named James Rees, and an oil expert. All of this with the blessing of the American administration, which has actually established this fake company. This hostile American behavior towards Syria, which contradicts with international law, the late international law, the Charter of the United Nations, the Martyr Charter of the United Nations, and the Security Council resolutions, did not come as a surprise, as the US administration had facilitated the possession and the trafficking of the terrorist organizations ISIS with the looted Syrian oil and its smuggling to Turkey in cooperation with the terrorism sponsoring Erdogan regime. Furthermore, the US administration has continued through its illegal alliance to launch repeated attacks on the Syrian Arab army forces to prevent them from liberating the areas occupied by the terrorist organization ISIS in northeastern Syria. This is exactly the meaning of creative chaos. Just 2 days ago, 2 American military helicopters attacked a checkpoint of the Syrian Arab army southeast of Qamishli, killing 1 soldier and wounding 2 others. We all remember the sinful attack by the American occupation forces on the sites of the Syrian Arab army in the Al-Tharda mountain in Deir ez-Zor on September 17th, 2016, to enable the terrorist organization ISIS to control these sites, and therefore the city of Deir ez-Zor as a whole. Furthermore, US President Donald Trump previously announced on 27th of October 2019 that he, and I quote, intends to conclude a deal with an American company to go to Syria and obtain its share of Syrian oil, unquote. Trump reaffirmed his endeavor on the 1st of November 2019 by announcing his intention to keep Syrian oil because he, I quote, loves Syrian oil. Trump reaffirmed his endeavor, as I said. It is well known to all that the US administration had allowed US oil companies, whose work was supervised by former US Vice President Dick Cheney, to extract Syrian oil from the occupied Syrian Golan in a flagrant violation of the relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. Here we ask, does this express the respect of the United Nations, the hosting country of this organization, and the permanent member of the Security Council, that it is entrusted with contributing to the maintenance of international peace and security, of international law, the United Nations Charter, and a political solution in Syria? Mr. President, the recent period has also witnessed the American Creative and International Associates concluding a cooperation agreement with the so-called Civil Council in Deir ez-Zor city. They created something out of nowhere, and they called it Syrian Civil Council in Deir ez-Zor city, which operates under the umbrella of the Syrian Democratic Forces militias. These are the same militias that issued a few days ago the so-called Protection and Management of Absentee Property Law, which aims at looting the property of Syrians who were displaced due to concerted efforts of ISIS and SDF in changing the demographic composition of these areas. Is this agreement, sponsored by the American administration and its occupying forces, is it consistent with the commitment to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of my country? The shameful record of the United States of America against dozens of member states in this organization answers this question and shows the lack of belief of American administrations in the principles and purposes of this international organization. My country, Syria, condemns these practices and any similar acts of suspicious deals that take place with proxy separatist militias and terrorist entities or artificial bodies that do not have any legal capacity or status. Syria affirms that these practices are null, void, and have no legal effect, as they constitute a shameless assault against the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic and resources of its own people. The late international law must be now turning in its grave, lamenting such behavior. Mr. President, for its part, the Turkish regime continues its practices that aim at strengthening its occupation of parts of my country. The Turkish regime is trying to change legal, demographic, economic, and financial character of these occupied territories by the Turkification and displacement of inhabitants, plundering their real estates and property, imposing the use of Turkish currency, and naming squares and streets after Turkish and Ottoman figures. The Turkish regime even used Ottoman names for terrorist organizations and entities that it supervises, operates, and invests in its foreign wars in Libya and elsewhere as well. Let me name a few of these terrorist groups that have historic Ottoman names: Sultan Murad Brigade, Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih Brigade, and Nur al-Din al-Zinki movement, and others. These are the tip of the iceberg of the crimes perpetrated by the Erdogan regime that has never respected its pledges under the Astana Accords and the Sochi understandings, and committed every single prescribed crime, such as supporting terrorism, facilitating the infiltration of foreign terrorist fighters into Syria. I call them terrorists without border. Supplying terrorist organizations with toxic chemicals to use against civilians and fabricating accusations against the Syrian government. The Turkish regime has launched acts of aggression and occupation, including the aggression against the city of Kasab and the so-called Operation Peace Spring, and the Turkish military incursion into north and northwestern Syria, looting the factories and property of the Syrians in Aleppo and its countryside. 1,441 factories were stolen from Aleppo alone and shipped to inside of Turkey. And burning or looting agricultural crops and trading with ISIS and terrorist organizations in oil and looted antiquities and others. At the time this session is being held, more than 1 million Syrians from Al-Hasaka and its countryside live without drinking water in light of intense heat and fear of the outbreak of the coronavirus. This is all the result of this Council's silence on the Turkish regime's continued use of water as a weapon of war against 1 million Syrian civilians in Al-Hasaka by cutting drinking water off Al-Luk station for more than 15 times for periods ranging between 2 and 10 days, and by reducing its production capacity to its minimum levels. How long will your council remain silent in the face of war, crimes, and crimes against humanity committed by Erdogan's regime? Do you have an answer? Syria reiterates that the presence of the Turkish military forces on Syrian territory is an act of aggression, occupation, and a gross violation of the principles of international law, the provisions of the United Nations Charter, and the principles of friendly relations and good neighborliness between adjacent countries. My country also affirmed that the Turkish regime confiscating and annexing swaths of Syrian lands and building what is called a separation wall on them will not change the legal status of these lands and their belonging to the Syrian Arab Republic, nor will it lead in any way to affect the legal and sovereign rights of the Syrian Arab Republic or its a precursor to any future binary demarcation, the Turkish regime's shielding behind its NATO membership in order to antagonize the neighboring countries and violate the sovereign rights of these countries, increases the responsibility of this alliance for the absence of stability in the entire Mediterranean region and raises escalation to unprecedented levels. Mr. President, the national delegation continues its preparations to participate in the next round of meetings of the Constitutional Committee, which will be held in Geneva a few days later. We reaffirm that this process is and must always be Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, without any external interference, and that the foundations that have been agreed upon and the terms of reference that have been reached must be upheld and respected and not allowed to be manipulated, to divert it from its assigned tasks and goals under any pretext. Yes, we say it over and over again, that the solution is political and exclusively Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, without any foreign interference. A solution whom Syrians themselves set its parameters in order to protect their country from vultures lurking in it, not according to criteria set by the American administration and Erdogan, who attack Syria and occupy its precious territories. It seems from the statement of my colleague, the American permanent representative, that her administration's policy towards my country is based on settling scores with any country standing with my country against the conspiracy targeting Syria and these same countries. Therefore, it is not strange that the American representative would start her statement speaking about Iran, as if the subject of today's meeting is discussing the predicament of the American administration after its withdrawal from Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known for short as JCPOA. Mr. President, Syria renews once again its demand for the Secretary General and the Security Council to take urgent action in response to the complaint submitted on the 31st of May 2020, condemning the acts of aggression, occupation, and external interference in its internal affairs of Syria, as well as the disastrous effects of unilateral coercive measures imposed by the US administration and the European Union, despite the pleas of the Secretary General and the Special Envoy and many others. These measures prevent the Syrians from obtaining their basic needs of food, medicine, and medical equipment, especially in light of the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and its dire impacts. They also represent a crime of deliberate killing of the people of the countries affected by these sanctions. A final friendly word for my colleague, the Special Envoy, Mr. Peterson. I heard you describing in your statement the American occupation forces as the international coalition forces. Naturally, the late international law, the Martyr Charter, the envoy himself, the council, and all, and me, we all know that the presence of the American forces in my country is illegitimate and mere occupation. Therefore, I urge you, my friend, to reconsider the use of this term in the future. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I see no person are asking for the floor. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.